I would say I've always been very confused with my gender identity.
Abortion can be another word for mercy.
People are suffering.
Could put
People are dying.
half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
Are collapsing.
Every city in the United States has become much
That's the solution.
When we're deciding whether to send our kids to a public school, a private school, or homeschool, we need to start with this clear view, a very clear view of what God's mandate is in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. And that mandate, that command to us, was that we need to make sure that the truths that our children believe, the values and virtues that they love and aspire towards, and what they assume about their world and how it works is the same as Jesus' view on all of those things.
Right.
That's the goal. In this whole discussion, that's the goal. Which one works best, public, private Christian, or homeschool? Because at the end of the day, that's what we'll give an account to Jesus for how we parented our kids. So the question is, what do we need to know about the public school system in order to inform our decision of whether or not we should send our kids to a public school? I think there's three general areas of interest that we need to consider. I want to hit these three areas for each of the three choices, and that is culture, curriculum, and community. Okay, what is the culture? What's the curriculum? What's the community? By culture, I mean, what are the virtues and values and aspirations that define what is right and good and worthy in your pursuit of according to that educational community? Okay, I butchered that, so I'm going to say it again. When we're talking about the culture of a school, say a public school, we're asking the question, what are the virtues, what are the values, and what are the aspirations that define what that community says you should aspire to? Because that's what's going to be pumped into your kids.
Yeah.
Okay, regardless of where it's at. Curriculum, that's pretty simple. Ask the question, what is it and how is it being taught? You know, the content of the curriculum is important. Third, community. This is more along the lines of, okay, who's there, who makes up this community, what kind of influence is that going to have on my child, my family, what kind of opportunities or challenges will it bring to our child or our family, and you know, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? So those are the areas that I want to hit, and I want to start with culture first, okay? Now I'm talking about the educational culture of the public school that your child may go to specifically. What is the educational culture of our public school system in America? Because that's going to impact the one that your kid's going to go to. And how should that factor into our decision about whether or not we should send our kids to that particular school? Now, granted, we have all seen, I'm guessing, the videos on Facebook and YouTube, and they pop up on Instagram and other places, I believe, about activist teachers. These are the people that look certifiably crazy that are talking about how they want to indoctrinate your kids in the classroom. Okay, those are out there. Those are probably still a little more on the extreme side because you get that, but it's not always as bad as you see on the internet. We've seen stories in the news for years now about parents fighting school boards over critical race theory and DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion inspired curriculum. And, you know, we've all heard the stories about the kinds of books that are being assigned for kids to read, all the way down to little kids' books that are so graphic and so sexually explicit. In some cases, I can't even read them.
Yeah, books that should never be in the classroom for young children, ever.
Yeah, and this happens, okay? And I wanted to stay up to date. So again, when I was preparing for this conversation, I looked up what the latest one was that people are fighting about. And the excerpt that I got, and it was a book that was assigned to high schoolers, and the excerpt that I looked at was literally so bad that even as desensitized as I am for being older, I couldn't read it. I had to scan through it so I knew what I was looking at, but I did not have the capacity to read through it. It was so graphic and so X-rated. I don't see any value in that personally for classroom,
right, but it's considered literature
happening
for the classroom.
So I want to acknowledge that all those things are out there and they are in the public school system, and those are all very, you know, they're extremely important for us to talk about in the right place and at the right time. But having said that, the question that I want to start with today is, how is it that we have an educational environment in our public schools in which those things can take place? How do we have that environment? You know, how did the culture get there? because since it is there, we have to deal with it if we're thinking about sending our kids to those schools. In order to answer that question, we have to look at the big picture of education in America. And I recognize for any of those of you out there that have actually studied this, this is just a snapshot. I don't intend to be completely exhaustive in my description here. It would get long and boring and you'd all click off onto another video. So I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to give you the snapshot so that you can see the information that you need to know in order to work through this. So roughly speaking, for about the first 100 years of our country, the education of our children was the domain of family and church, okay? It was family and church that basically decided how it was going to go and pulled it off on a day-to-day basis. Now, in that environment, the education that our kids received followed a philosophy that was born out of Greek and Roman and Hebrew cultures. Now, generally speaking, it's what we now refer to as a classical education, and it focused on developing specific virtues such as courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. And it also focused on developing the skills necessary to identify truth and pursue these virtues in their various expressions in our culture. In other words, they taught critical thinking skills so that you could think and evaluate and decide for yourself, so that you could take the virtues that were instilled in you and live them out in your work, in your family, in your relations with other people, so on and so forth. So that was classical education. Now, like I said, that's a super simplified description. But the fruit of this education, what we got in our kids, was a paideia in them that was consistent with traditional Western culture and basic Christian principles. Okay? But then, during the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, an extremely significant change took place. Okay? The U.S. government established a free, compulsory education system that we now call the public schools. So public schools are actually government schools. I don't say that to disparage them. That's just the fact of what it is. Public schools are government schools. And the people in the government who have had by far the greatest amount of influence in running these schools for the last 100 years are the progressives or the political liberals. And over the past 100 years, they have successfully replaced the classical approach with an approach that is more secular and humanistic. Mm-hmm. And by replacing that approach, they have replaced the kind of paideia that they are forming in our children through that educational system. It's no longer one that reflects traditional Western and Christian values that are consistent with the paideia of Jesus. Instead, the new paideia is one that reflects the principles of cultural Marxism and secular humanism. And here's the way they did it. Once again, still very important as far as our decision-making process goes. They didn't start with the curriculum. And I say that because that's where I tend to look. That's where most of us tend to look. Most of the Christian parents I've talked to, matter of fact, without exception, every Christian parent I've talked to about this starts with looking at the curriculum. But we ought to know they didn't walk into the classroom one day and swap out all of the old classical lessons for new lessons that blatantly taught cultural Marxism and the principles of secular humanism. It didn't go like that. Instead, they changed what is called the pedagogy that drives education. Now, once again, another weird word. If you're not a teacher, you don't talk about
like big words.
much, but it's an important word, okay? All pedagogy means is the philosophy, the methods, and the purposes that shape the way education is accomplished in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So it's the methodology, it's the why, it's the how, it's that whole thing. And once they changed the pedagogy, they changed the hearts of the teachers. And once they changed the paideia of the teachers, they changed the culture of the educational environment. And once they changed the culture of the educational environment, they were able to change the paideia that was being produced in our students.
Right. So essentially, it's something that was a change that happened slowly over time.
Right.
So you look at something that started 100 years ago, but we're really seeing the effects of it within the educational system today.
Yeah, it actually took about 50-some years for the new pedagogy and the new paideia to start to show up. And then it started very slowly, and now we're seeing it to degrees at an increasing rate. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you see, when you do that long enough, it's like I said, we've been at this 100 years in this country. Most people don't even know it's been going on. Mm-hmm. But when you do that long enough, you see the changes that are taking place in our culture today. I mean, for those of us that are a little bit older, it's easy to say, wow, what happened? It's like overnight. It's like, no, this is the culture of the educational system that has been bred in for a century, basically.
Yeah.
And it's important for us to know that the replacement of the paideia that was being produced in our kids to the paideia that's being produced in them now was intentional. This was not accidental. This is an educational philosophy that they wanted in the schools. Generally speaking, the educational environment in our public schools has been specifically crafted over the past 100 years or so to produce a paideia in our children that is consistent with secular humanism and cultural Marxism instead of the paideia that God calls us to in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. So, when we consider the possibility of enrolling our child in a government school, wisdom dictates, wisdom requires for us to appropriately consider the potential influence of this kind of culture on the formation of our kids' idea. We're going to talk about homeschooling, get into that. So the question is, what do we really need to know about homeschooling to inform our decision of whether or not we're going to choose that option for our family? And we're going to hit the same 3 criteria that we did when we had our conversation about public schools. And that's we're going to look at the culture, the curriculum, and the community. By culture, I'm talking about the part that really forms that paideia. What are the virtues? What are the values? What are the aspirations that are championed in that particular educational environment that define what is right and what is good and what's worthy for us and our children to pursue in our life? Curriculum talks about basically the tools that they're using to study. Those are the learning materials used. What's in it? How is it being taught? And what are the intended outcomes that you're trying to accomplish with that particular curriculum? Community, basically it's a question of who's in it. What kind of influence and opportunities and challenges is that particular community going to bring to your child?
Yeah, and as somebody who taught public school, I don't have a lot to say about homeschool. And Amy, you taught in private school. So we're super happy to have Heather with us today because she is the one who is that homeschool champion. She's got a lot of experience outside of homeschooling as well, but she chose to homeschool her kids. So it's nice to have you with us to have that conversation because I know you're going to really have a lot to offer and to shape that conversation today.
I hope so.
So let's talk about culture first then. Actually, in my opinion, I think this is probably one of the sweet spots of homeschooling because when it comes to homeschooling, you're the schoolmaster. I know when we were talking about public school, I walked through that whole little bit of history where we looked at, about 100 years ago, I think it was, give or take. Now, we switched to a public school system, which is basically government-run schools, a free compulsory education. But when we did that, the government became the schoolmaster, and there's positives and negatives to that. I mean, it's a free education, but you don't have really any control into what's put into the educational system. So with homeschooling, all that's changed. It's like, Heather, as a homeschooler, you're the schoolmaster. We were chatting before we started the recordings, like you're not just mom now, but you're principal, you're teacher, you're the whole thing. So, that's one, I think, sweet spot of homeschooling, because like I said, you get to be in charge.
Yeah.
It's your show to run. But when you choose to homeschool and you've reclaimed your role of schoolmaster, now you've got control over the culture of your kids' education. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing I want to get into here. You get to be the one that decides what are the virtues, what are the values, what are the affections, and what are the basic truths and the basic worldview you want to build into them. So you've replaced the teachers' unions at this point. NEA and AFT ain't got no say anymore.
Yeah.
It's just, they're out of the picture. And you get to determine the pedagogy. By the way, as a homeschool mom, you know what I'm talking about with pedagogy?
Vaguely.
Okay, you're in the vast majority. It's another one of those weird words that, you go to work, you don't sit around at the water cooler and talk about the pedagogy that's being used in your child's education.
Okay.
But really, it's another weird word that we don't use all the time, but it's simple. Pedagogy is the philosophy, the methods, and the purposes that shape the way that education is accomplished in your home. And it's hugely important because it's pedagogy that defines outcome, especially when it comes to the culture. And that learning environment that you create, of course, is going to have a huge impact on your kids.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about some of the benefits and the challenges that come with being in that role.
Yeah, I would say in our home, my children were in a charter school, which is still public education. And when COVID hit and we went to remote learning, I noticed a huge shift in the culture of our family. The rush to get to school in the morning, the extended hours of homework at night kind of left our time for Bible study and prayer in the margins, and that bothered me. We had all kinds of mechanisms in place to kind of try to squeeze it in, whether it was on the drive to school or just memorizing scripture together so that we could talk about it throughout the week, and doing nightly routines and things. But it bothered me that that was pushed to the margins. And so when we went on remote learning, I found we were getting up in the morning and we were starting the day with worship. We were starting the day with a Bible reading and study. And so being able to do that really shifted the way my kids even interacted with each other. It seemed like they had gone from saving their best selves for everyone at school, and then maybe a little bit of the ugliness came out when they were around each other more so, and instead they were thriving and they were getting along better. So I would say that that would fit into the values and virtues more reflected in our time than it did when we were in traditional school. So we make sure to, it's my job to maintain this, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and to instill that priority at home, which has proven to just be a beautiful thing for our family.
Yeah, I've found myself thinking many times, having never been a homeschool family, I found myself thinking many times, okay, I understand what Deuteronomy chapter 6 says. I understand that as a parent, it's my responsibility to shape my kids, especially in this deep heart area that we're talking about, you know, those deep beliefs and those deep affections that really impact everything that they do. But we get up in the morning and our kids run off to school, and they go to a great school. They're in a private Christian school. And yeah, I love the teachers. I love the environment, all that. But it's like, I don't get to disciple them as much as I would, I think, if I was in a homeschool situation, because they're gone.
Yeah.
You know, I opened our show on public school by talking about 16,000 hours. That's the amount of time that your kid's going to spend in a classroom, whether it be homeschool classroom or in a schoolhouse classroom, from kindergarten through 12th grade. I'm giving that to somebody else. And in this particular case, I trust the people that I'm giving it to, but it's not me.
Right.
And I think as a homeschool mom, you're talking about you take that out of the equation. Not only does it open up more time to actually build those values in, but you can be really, really intentional about doing it.
And it's so personalized, right? Because even though I have 6 kids, 6 is a lot less than 20, right? So I can tailor a lot of what we're doing, what we're studying. My older kids now are reading. Right now we're reading A.W. Tozer together because I was finding it was impacting me so much, and I was talking to them about it all the time anyway. So it just made sense for them to join me in reading some of his work. But the younger ones, you know, need different things, so I'm able to kind of tailor toward them as well.
Yeah, I'm curious about the whole values, virtues, and affections thing, because I think in most of the conversations I have, you kind of walk away with the sense that, well, yeah, those things are more caught than taught. Yeah, your kids see where your affections lie. They see your values because it comes out in your words and your actions and all that kind of stuff. But aren't there some challenges that come along with that too when you're trying to be intentional in an educational environment? What do those look like?
Yeah, well, there's a lot, but you mentioned being headmaster and mom. That can be really hard if they see my flaws, which they do, and then I'm also telling them, you know, that they can't do X, Y, or Z. That can be an issue. I don't really have a lot of alone time. I was just telling Amy, you know, if I have like 20 minutes, it's either I'm just devouring something I'm reading, scripture, or sleeping.
Mom gets a nap.
Yeah, so there's not a lot of alone time, which can be a big challenge. Yeah, being headmaster and enforcing some of those things, making sure that they're getting through the things that they need to get through. Another challenge is for me to keep the priorities straight. My background is elementary education, and I can start getting kind of caught up in this rat race. We need to get this curriculum done. We need to get this curriculum done. You have to know these things before you graduate or before the end of this year. And actually, Amy was kind enough to remind me that even classroom teachers don't get through entire curriculum.
Really.
That was such a relief for me. And just thinking, okay, I need to make sure we're keeping the main thing. And that's the beauty of homeschool, that I can readjust at any point and we're fine. We'll get to it when we get to it.
And I would imagine too that obviously they're your kids. You're with them for all of those 16,000 hours that you're going through. So they can't get away with anything. You know them backwards and forwards. You know all the little tricks that they'd be trying to pull on their teachers. So I mean, you're more equipped than anybody else would ever be, really. To have, such a focused span of attention on your kids every day. That when you're in the thick of the education, we're going to talk about curriculum in a minute, but maybe there's a book that you're reading, since you're headmaster, principal, teacher, everything, and mom, then because you know your kids so well, it seems to me that you've got an advantage even over a skilled teacher who may just have your kid walk into the class, that semester. To be able to pull something out of maybe a story or an assignment that you were reading and to highlight, hey, this is one of those basic truths that Jesus holds that you need to have built in you. And even if you're not telling them, you can customize that and really be intentional about getting it done. So that, because it's easy to say, well, caught not taught, they're with you, but there's a lot of other influences in their lives that they're getting. I mean, the homeschool kids don't come out of a closet and get educated and go back in a closet. It's like, no, they have lives.
They have
and
very
they have
active
friends,
lives.
And they see TV and the social media is out there. But one of the things I want to hit at was when you're doing your investigation, like I said, just because there's a cross on the wall doesn't mean they believe everything that you believe. And that may affect the pedagogy of the education. And once again, this is a word that unless you're a professional educator, you probably don't use it very much. But pedagogy is not that hard to understand. It's basically the philosophy, the methods, and the purposes that shape the way that you're doing something. In this case, it's education. You can have a pedagogy for how you flip houses. You can have a pedagogy for a lot of things. It's what's your method, what's your philosophy. All that stuff drives not only how you do it, but the outcomes that you're seeking. So you have to ask questions for your educator, what are those things? Have them explain it to you. They may be impressed that you know one of their words. What's the pedagogy that drives the education here? What methods do you use? What are the things that you emphasize? Because you're asking about what are the virtues and the values and the affections that they have. The truth stuff is easy to get. You can read mission statements. You can ask specific questions about curriculum and get that information. But the values, virtues, and affections part, that's where the pedagogy comes in to a big degree. So, like I said, don't assume, ask questions. And then there's another little piece you need to consider about Christian schools, and that's to ask the question, up front, you'll probably be able to tell pretty quickly, is this a traditional Christian school or is it a classical Christian education that's being offered there? Those are two distinctly different types of approaches to education. Both of them have their strong points, I think, and like everything, they've got their downsides to them. But here's what I mean by traditional. Just this is a traditional educational environment. You got teacher-led instruction, single subject-based curriculum, textbook-based learning. This probably sounds like your school if you're over 40, right? You get assessment through testing. That's pretty normal. Conformity to rules and authority figures. In other words, the classroom is not a democracy. The teacher is in charge. Character development is an emphasis. Integration of faith and learning, at least in a Christian traditional school, you'll get that piece. Here's how classical runs. It runs pretty much along the same course, but it places a greater emphasis on the pursuit of truth through reason. It's not that traditional doesn't, but there's a greater emphasis, I think, in the typical classical environment where they focus on that. There's a focus on development of virtues. those become like forefront. Virtues like courage, moderation, beauty, justice, wisdom, things like that. It incorporates the study of primary sources in classical literature. You know, your kids will be reading all the books that you probably never read if you were in public school, like
Homer, Beowulf.
Yeah.
They get all of it.
All the ones that we see, you know, those kids bringing home. There's the study of the classical languages. In a classical Christian school, you'll get Latin mostly. Sometimes there'll be Greek involved in the curriculum. And probably the most distinctive one, and the one that you'll see on their website, is they use the trivium as part of their pedagogy, which is a 3-tiered learning approach. And they'll describe it to you as grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Mm-hmm. And by grammar, they're not just talking about how to put commas in the right place. They're talking about learning the basic rules and facts of the subject matter, you know, the things that kind of the mechanical things that drive it. And then there's the whole idea of logic, which is developing analytical reasoning and critical thinking skills. And then rhetoric, that's expressing ideas effectively through speech and writing. So if they're using a classical curriculum, if they're doing a classical approach, you will probably find in the senior year that the kids will have to do some sort of a thesis where it's like a capstone sort of all-inclusive project where they take a subject and they use the grammar of it. They've employed the logic of it. And now they're doing the rhetoric piece of it as part of the capstone of the high school education. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's traditional and classical in a nutshell. So what are the benefits and challenges that come with this? Oh, private school educator.
I don't know. I think I was learning from you all about the classical because I'm used to teaching in the traditional environment. And so classical is something that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah. And I wanted to go through that because, I mean, I've been around this stuff for ages and I didn't even know all the distinctives until I sat down and looked it up. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I figured it would be good to go through it.
Yeah.
But yes.
Well, it's interesting when you've got Christian education. The Bible is really integrated into all subject areas. I know that's something that you found at the school that you were at, that the Bible isn't just a subject matter, which it's that as well, but then it's integrated into every single aspect. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're talking about your literature, where does God's word play into that? When you're looking at history, where do you see what God has been doing to lead the course of history? It's really quite fascinating when you start to actually look at everything from a biblical perspective.
Yeah, that falls into both the culture of the school, but also then into the curriculum,
Correct.
Which we're going to talk about in a second. But that culture of, is that something that the teachers are trained to do, is to biblically integrate the curriculum, or is it just a Christian curriculum that you just teach that curriculum? Those are two very different things. So teachers have to understand that biblical worldview and how to incorporate it in everything that you teach. So that's a very good question to ask. Is that a value and a virtue of this school? That integration, and our teachers trained in that direct way.
Yeah, because when you think about it, if you want to have the paideia of Jesus, what's the best place to get it from?
From the Bible.
What's the biblical integration that comes into the curriculum? Yeah. I mean, that's where the culture is formed out of, hopefully. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's talk about curriculum, because that's where I want to talk more about.
Oh, good. Amy's anxious. Yeah, I think the culture piece is pretty self-explanatory in this piece. These are people who are like-minded, hopefully share the same values. There's a strong emphasis on character development. All that comes from hopefully a biblically based or a biblically integrated Christian curriculum. So yeah, then you move on to curriculum. What's in it? How's it being taught? And what are the intended outcomes? So what are some of the concerns?
When you look at curriculum, first of all, is it a Christian curriculum or is it a secular curriculum? Because any school could go either direction. Personally, as I've done a lot of curriculum development, looking at the Christian ones, they tend to be a little bit more dull and boring. There's not as much money to go into the development of it, especially when it comes to color and design and be pleasing to the eye.
So when you say dull and boring, it's more presentation?
A lot more presentation, but even then the stories that they draw from, it just seems to be, there's less. So the schools that I've taught at pretty much across the board tended to use secular curriculum, but the teachers are trained in how to biblically integrate it and also to think critically. So as you're going through the curriculum, I'm teaching this, is this an appropriate story, or are there aspects in it? And you can pull out things to talk to the kids about of, all right, they're teaching this through this story, but is that godly? Does that reflect godly values and virtues in us? Or how would you respond in this situation? There's just so many things that you can do with that. They just have greater resources when it comes to the secular curriculum. A lot of schools will choose like one curriculum for reading that might be secular, but a Christian history curriculum. So it doesn't have to be straight across the board, just one company across the board, but pick and choose through them. Every school will do it differently. So think critically as you look at the different curriculum of what's being used, flip through the books. If you were a student, would you like to learn from this? Would this, stimulate your mind to want to read, to want to do math? Math was a hard one. I think almost everybody across the board has a hard time with biblical integration in math. But who created math? God did. God created the stars in the sky, the sand in the seashore. He's the ultimate mathematician. And so always pointing back as you're doing math that unless you have a brain for math, kids really struggle with that. And there's a lot of complaining when it comes to math. So reminding kids that God is the one who created this, and he gave us the mind of Christ so we can learn this, we can do this. So there are ways to pull Christ into everything that we're learning in the classroom. It's not just having, like you said before, a cross on the wall or a verse on the wall. It's so much deeper than that as you're training kids to love the Lord, to behave in a godly manner. And what does that look like? Because let's get real, kids are kids. We all sin. We all make mistakes. Things happen at school. And you have to walk them through all those situations and circumstances that can happen anywhere. But how do you do it in a godly way and point them to Christ?
Yeah, I remember the first time I was being detective dad and asking a Christian school that we were looking at putting our kids in, what their curriculum was. And the person I was talking to actually turned out to be a great lady. She said, oh, we use Common Core this and blah, 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 blah. And of course, all the alarm bells went off. And, then years later, and they actually used it in a good way. They did a pretty good job. But years later, I was on the board of the school I was referring to earlier, and we were making curriculum choices. And I learned that the curriculums that these schools have to buy are very expensive.
Very expensive.
And unfortunately, just due to economies of scale, the Christian market is smaller. Therefore, Christian developed curriculum is more expensive.
Yeah.
So it's not uncommon for a private Christian school to buy a secular curriculum and then integrate back in the biblical principles.
Yeah.
But what it requires is for the teachers to do a lot of the work for taking that out. And the question that I would follow up with then is, okay, how is that done? How is it monitored? Because there is a lot of curriculum out there that is so infused with woke thinking that you have to know something about that in order to detect it. And I personally don't want any of that secular mindset being trained into my kids or driving the pedagogy that educates them. So when it comes to curriculum, that was my biggest concern when I was looking at it. And it may be something that you want to look at as well.